Good day, Grade 12 learners of South Africa. Today, here on Mindset, we are going to be working through the last section of environment. Okay, so welcome, and let's get down to it. First of all, we have the interaction in a community. We're going to be looking at competition specifically. We're going to be looking at symbiosis. Remember, that means living together. We're going to look at the human influence, which is quite bad, and the ecological succession. And this is a new one for all of you. So let's start with competition. Remember, there are two types of competition that we're going to be looking at, intraspecific and interspecific. Now, what is competition? It's the interaction between the various species that inhabit an ecosystem. So we're going to have the community. Okay, so it's the community within the ecosystem or communities. Now, there are two types of competition that exist in an ecosystem, and you must know the definitions. First one we're looking at is intraspecific. Intra always means inside. So if it is, you'll know intracellular, it is inside the cell. So intraspecific competition occurs within the same species, and that will be for food, for water, for mates, for living and breeding space. Because remember, they need space to make their nests, etc., and also to just live. This here is your definition. And people, please make sure you know this definition. So it's intraspecific competition occurs within the same species, and that will be for food and water and mates and living and breeding space. It ensures that the strongest win the territory, and therefore the best genes are passed on to the next generation by natural selection. And this whole process here forms part of what we call diversity. And diversity is what we are going to do in our next section of work. So it's part of the whole survival of the fittest and natural selection. Intraspecific. The strongest are going to get the mates, they're going to get the living space because they're going to fight for it. Now, many studies have been conducted to show that the physiological changes that take place in the individual of a population, and that is because of overcrowding. Okay, things change. Organisms become agitated, they become stressed, and when they become stressed, they become aggressive. And when they're aggressive, they will fight to the kill. It's actually very sad to see organisms behave like that. Okay, in many species, natality will decrease when there is overcrowding, and mortality increases. Now remember, natality is the birth rate, and mortality is the death rate. Okay, and that's going to increase as the population density increases. Why? There's a lack of food, shelter, space. There's a lot of fighting. The females become infertile. So all these things will play a role. Social aggression results, and they literally fight to the death. Fecundity, which decreases with stress. Now remember, fecundity is the ability of the female to produce fertile eggs. So the females will start to miscarry, and those that aren't pregnant are going to become infertile. Fecundity, we've done before, the ability of the female to produce fertile and viable eggs. Now, diseases, as soon as there are lots of organisms and there is overcrowding, they're going to be transmitted rapidly. So you end up infecting, or they will end up infecting each other very quickly. And then we also have malfunctioning of the endocrine system. And that malfunctioning of the endocrine system is what could result in the fecundity. Okay. Here I've taken a picture from Wikipedia, and this copyright is held by Galen Royal. He took this photo of penguins, and penguins also, they live in the middle of nowhere on ice, but they still have their little environment, and they still have their pecking order, so to speak, and you're going to have your strongest males fighting for the females. All right, then we have inter inter-specific competition. The word inter always means between. So we have competition between different species. And that's going to be in plants, for example, for light, because the plants need light in order to photosynthesize and survive. So let's just put photosynthesis here so that it sort of makes sense to you. Okay, photosynthesis, and then if it's the animals, it'll be for food. Remember, light and photosynthesis is the food for plants, and water and space, and we can actually add shelter here as well. All right, in a given area, for example, and I've used this example before, a lion and a cheetah compete for the same prey, okay? And your different buck species will compete for grass. But remember that this interspecific competition is within an ecosystem. And within that ecosystem, you are going to have many communities. Okay, and those many communities are going to, each community is going to be made up of or a number of populations. So if we look at interspecific competition, and we can think of lots and lots of examples, we'll have lions and we have the cheetahs. Now they will feed on impala. Cheetahs and lions will eat impala. The cheetahs love springbuck, and they're fast enough to catch them, although the lions battle to catch the springbuck. You've got the wildebeest, are far too big for a cheetah to catch, but the lions as a pride can catch the wildebeest. And at the end of the day, the springbuck and the impala and the wildebeest are going to eat wild grass and the plants and the shrubs that are around. So indirectly, your cheetah is dependent on wild grass, and your lions are dependent on the wild grass. Why? They don't specifically eat the wild grass, but the organisms that they eat are dependent on the wild grass. If we look at this process here, which is competitive exclusion. Now, for our learners that are where English is a second or a third or even a fourth language, competitive means to compete. It means to be able to compete. Exclusion means to stop something from being part of a group or a process. So competitive exclusion means that the competition is excluded. So let's look at the definition here. We have competitive exclusion. It's when a species less suited to compete for resources becomes excluded. In other words, that species isn't equipped to compete properly, and therefore it will become excluded. So it will be pushed out of that environment. If there are enough natural resources, the different species may cohabit. It means that they live together in an area, and an equilibrium will exist for a period. So in other words, there's going to be a balance. We've got species A and we've got species B, and they are quite happy to live there on the natural resources, and they cohabit. Now, the problem comes in. One species is always going to be more dominant. Why? Because if we go back here, it is better suited to compete. So if it's dominant, it's generally better suited or better adapted. Better adapted to that area. Better adaptation, it is able to survive better with less problems. And what happens then is this species that's more dominant starts to force the other species to adapt to a different ecological niche, or it has a choice to die and become extinct. And the minute that organism leaves that area and it goes to a different ecological niche, it's going to minimize the competition. So what you literally have is one organism that becomes dominant. and one species, one type of organism becomes dominant, and it will slowly but surely push the other species out. So let's say in an area where there is only grass, your giraffe is not going to survive because giraffes don't eat grass. Giraffes eat leaves off plants. And remember, they can't bring their necks down to such a degree all the time. I mean, it's a big thing for them to be able to drink water and bring their head down to drink water. So they are not adapted to live in an area where there is only grass. There must be trees in order for the giraffe to survive. So in an area where all the trees are chopped down and there are giraffes, the giraffes will have to move or they will die. They will not have food. Okay, and your grass eaters, your impala, your little springbuck, they'll be okay. Why? Because they graze. And that's how we minimize the competition. So we exclude the one species from the competition. In the case of two types of algae, now, if I was setting your exam, I would give you a graph where I showed, or a results table and ask you to do the graph, but I would give you a graph on two different types of algae or bacteria that live in the same environment. And you're going to find that one is always going to dominate over the other. So they live in the same area, and eventually competition forces one of them to die out. Okay, so in the case of two types of algae inhabiting the same pond, the more adapted species is going to survive. The one that is less adapted, what's going to happen to that little species? Well, it's going to be excluded because eventually it will die out. So we'll have competitive exclusion. There will only be a decline in the numbers of the weaker species to a point of extinction. Competition within and between the species results in natural selection. Now, competition within will be intra-specific, okay? And the competition between the species is going to be inter-specific competition. And what it does is it ends up with natural selection. And we know natural selection is survival of the fittest. So, and the organisms that are the fittest, they are going to survive. And if they survive, they pass their good, strong, adapted genes on to the next generation. Now, people, we move on to something called resource partitioning. Okay. Partitioning, well, if I have a room and I want to divide that room into two parts, I'm going to put a partition in. So that's what partitioning is. Resource, well, the resources would be food, water, shelter, space. And we're going to now divide the resources. So when an organism becomes specialized, in other words, it's very adapted to its environment, to that specific ecosystem, there's less chance of direct competition. Why? Because in specializing within that ecosystem, it's going to make sure that it has no competition. So there isn't going to be any direct competition, like, for example, between lions and leopards. You're going to take away that competition, so one of them is going to lose out. With resource competition, resource partitioning, and this is your definition here, is the specialization that occurs in different species to use different resources that are available in an ecosystem as a mechanism for survival. Now, if we go back to the example of the lions and the cheetahs. A cheetah, do you remember cheetahs generally live on their own. They don't hunt in packs, like wild dogs, for example, or lions that hunt in a pride. Okay, so one single lone cheetah, even though it is exceptionally fast, all right, and it can steer at incredible speeds, it can catch only smaller buck, or it can catch babies, but it can't go and tackle a buffalo. The buffalo, no matter what that cheetah does, the cheetah is 99 out of 100 times not going to be able to get that buffalo down on the ground so it can grab it at its throat and rip its throat out. Okay, its esophagus, or at least its trachea out. It can't kill that animal, it's too big. The same with an elephant. Cheetahs do not hunt elephant, okay? But a pride of lions will attempt to hunt buffalo and will attempt to hunt elephant. So if we have a nature park where we have lions and we have cheetahs, and we only have buffalo and elephant, the cheetahs will starve to death. There will be no direct competition for the lion. So that's where we are going to get resource partitioning, okay? It's a specialization that occurs in different species to use different resources that are available, okay? And what is it? It's a mechanism for survival. The same with your giraffes. Animals cannot reach the same heights, other animals, as a giraffe can. So if there are exceptionally high trees, well, the giraffe will eat the leaves at the top of the tree. Whereas your other kinds of buck will only be able to reach the bottom of the trees. Again, that would be resource partitioning. It leads to less competition and a more stable community structure because everyone eats a certain part of the community. Now, if we look at resource partitioning between plants, okay, what are plants going to have? Plants want light. That's the biggest element that plants want is light. Well, it's light and water, really, but light. So if there's water for all the plants, the soil's going to get the same amount of water. It's going to be light that plants are going to compete for. So in the South, and here are just a couple of examples. In the South African savannas, grasses have shallow root systems, while shrubs are deeper down. And then you get your big trees that are really deep down. So if this is the soil, you're going to find your grass roots here. You're going to find your shrubs will have deeper roots. So they've got access to deeper soil water. And your trees are going to have really deep, adventitious tap roots that go down. So they are competing for water, but at different levels. That would be an example of resource partitioning. Okay, again, if we look at light, so here we've got, in a forest, you've got different stories or different plant layers. Your tall trees are right at the top, and then you've got your shrubs down low, and then you've got your creepers. And these plants are all able to live together because they need different amounts of light to survive. So clearly, if I have a forest floor here, and I've got my trees, okay, now these trees clearly need lots of light because as they grow up, they're growing towards light. But if you look down here, there's not a lot of light down here. So you're going to find your smaller shrubs growing in here, and those little shrubs are going to need less light. So that would be less light, and this would be more light. Why? Because they're growing up. And then you're going to have your creepers and stuff in between here, and they need very little light. Like for example, your ferns would be down the bottom here, and the creepers. And there, because of the different layers, you've got the layer of the top trees, and then your different shrubs, and then the bottom plants, which would be your ferns and creepers, they don't need as much light, so they're quite happy to grow at the bottom. Where coniferous plants like the pitcher plant and the non-coniferous plants grow together, there's little competition for soil nutrients. Why? Because your coniferous plants are getting their nutrients from the insects they're eating, and your non-coniferous plants, well, they use water and light. So there is very little competition there, or actually no competition. Okay, people, now we go to resource partitioning in animals. All right, first of all, if you look at the birds, like, for example, the finches that Darwin had on the Galapagos Islands, the beaks are modified to eating different types of food. So a beak that eats insects versus a beak that's going to be picking up seeds off the ground or tearing flesh, for example, like in a hawk or an eagle, drilling holes in bark, you woodpeckers, cracking hard shells and nuts like a parrot-type beak, for example. They all modify to eat different food. So we have resource partitioning. The resources of insects and seeds and flesh-eating birds and digging holes in bark and eating nuts, those are the resources. And they've been divided up based on the kind of beak that a bird does have. Okay, in a forest, we have vertical separation. In other words, you've got the animals that live in the canopy. So if this is your forest, okay, your canopy dwellers are up here. And then you've got your forest floor dwellers are down the bottom here. And they don't compete for the same food. These guys are going to compete for something totally different to the monkeys that are cruising around in the top of the trees. Lions and leopards are predators, and they coexist in the same area, and we've gone through that one. I've discussed the buffaloes, for example, and the food they eat. Lions feed on larger buck because the females and the pride hunt together and are able to pull down a big animal, whereas your leopards, well, your cheetah's a solitary hunter and they can't. So they are quite happy to coexist in a stable environment, both as predators. Now, when the food is scarce, the lions sometimes steal the food from the leopard or cheetahs. And what do? Well, they go and stick their food up in a tree. Why? Lions can't climb trees. And I think that's so clever. So here we go with question 1. Here we've got species A. They don't tell you what the species is. It says species A is a consumer found in the grassland habitat. The data shows the number of individuals of the population of species A over a 14-week period. So here we're looking, we know that this can't be a large animal because if you look here, we start off with in week 1, 6 individuals, and in week 14 we have 70, and we look across our data here. By week 20, at least by week 10, 11, and 12, we're sitting on 120 organisms, which means that they've surpassed carrying capacity, and there is now environmental resistance. That's what we have here, and that will cause the population to decrease. Okay, now having looked at this, we now go on to our first question, and it says, draw a line graph to illustrate the growth curve of the population species A. Label the axes and provide a heading for this graph. Now here is our graph here. If we go back, to the previous question, it says the data shows the number of individuals in a population of species A over a period of 14 weeks. Okay, that would be your heading. Always give you your heading anyway. So here we go. We can actually just change it and shorten that to the growth curve of species A over a 14-week period. Okay, now that heading is going to give you a mark. All right, now, that's the easiest mark ever because it's in your question. Okay, now if we look here, there's our y-axis. Okay, y-axis, and there we have our x-axis. Time is always on the x-axis, so we're going to put time here, and our time is in weeks. All right, now if we look at our weeks, they're 14 weeks, so we're going to start with 0, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay, x-axis. Then on our y-axis, if we go back to our graph, the maximum number of organisms that we are ever going to have is 120. So we can always do 121 block back, or we can end up with 120 at the top. Makes no difference. But what I need for you to look at is if I've used 1 centimeter here, I'm going to use 1 centimeter blocks there. Your spacing for each line is very important. So here we're going to start off with, let's go, there's 20 and 40 and 60 and 80. You can put each, so you can go 10, 20, 30. I'm just making it quicker and easier. 80, 100, and there we'll have 120. Okay, so now we've got all our little organisms. But what is the y-axis? This is going to be the number of individuals. Okay, it's the number of individuals of this population. You can say number of individuals of species A if you really want to get technical here. Okay, now we have to plot. So how do we plot this? And this is, remember, we're going to get marks for plotting. So we've already got a mark for the correct heading. Now we have to give the this line graph, which is what we are drawing, and we're going to now see what. So at week 0, there are none. But at week 1, we have 6 individuals. So if that's 10, 6 will be approximately there. So at week 1, we are going to have approximately 6 organisms. So 10, 6 would be about there. Okay. Week 2, we've got 8, and week 3 is 16. So we go to 8. Mind you, let's take that 6 down a bit. Six will be just a little over 5, and that's 10, so 8 will be over there. And then at week 3 is 16, and then 26. So 16, and that 26, and 5 is 4, we go 40, 70, 96. So 40, 70, and then to 96, which should be about there. All right. And then we go 110 and 118, 110, 118, and then it was 120, 120, 120, and 110 and 70. 110, and then it drops all the way down to 70. So what we need to do now is draw a line across here. So we go, and you must make sure that your dots all join correctly. Where's 70 here? Okay, so what you're going to get here is 2 marks, at least 1 mark for drawing the correct type of graph. You've got 1 mark for the title. You're going to have 1 mark for the correct label for the x-axis and the y-axis. Okay, you're going to have 1 mark for all these dots being joined, so that's another mark there. You're going to have appropriate scale for the x-axis is another mark. The appropriate scale for the y-axis is another mark. And then they look at the actual drawing of this graph and they say, right, if all the points are correctly plotted, you get 2 marks. So that's another 2 marks. If they aren't, well, then you get 0. So people, this is a lot of marks. Let's count them. You've got 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 marks for having just drawn what is represented in this table here. If I was you, I would practice a whole bunch of graphing because you are going to get graphs in the exams. for paper 1 and for paper 2, and the same principles apply. Make sure that your blocks for the x-axis and your blocks for your y-axis, the spacing is the same so that you don't end up with a lopsided graph. Always write in a heading. If they ask you to draw a line graph, you draw a line graph. If it's a bar graph, you draw a bar graph, because you always get a mark for doing the correct graph. If your numbers are plotted correctly, you get another 2 marks. I mean, really, at the end of the day, the only marks here that you are getting for the graph ends up being 4 marks out of 9. The other 5 marks are for having put down what you're supposed to anyway. All right, 1.2, interpret and explain each phase as indicated by the results shown in this graph. So let's have a look. Now it's 10 marks, so let's see what these phases are going to be. Okay, I'm going to use, I think, pink. So let's have a look. We're looking at our phases, so we're going to look at the various parts of it. So if we look here, week 1, I can move this down a little bit more. Okay. Week 1 to 3, very, very slight increase here. So I would say between week 1 and 2 and week 1 and 3, this would be my first phase. So this is phase 1. Okay. Your next phase would be between weeks sort of 3 to 4. So here, going to about 8. So that would be your second phase. Your third phase would be from about week 8 to, I don't know, hey, let's just have a look here. You then hit a maximum here. So your maximum would be about week 10, I would say. So between week 8 and 10, there's another phase here. Then it all sort of levels off here, so this would be week 4, phase 4. And then if you look at this here, what do we have? We have the whole lot coming down and sorting itself out. So this would be my 5th phase. Okay? If we look at these phases, this shows us a logistic growth graph, and we've done logistic growth graphs. So what they're expecting you to do with this graph information is, although it's an environmental question, okay, about the different survival strategies of this specific species, you have to also be able to incorporate geometric growth curves, logistic growth curves, and this is a logistic growth curve. So what do we have? They want you to explain it. Well, during week 1, at least 1 to 3, maybe even, I would say definitely 1 to 3 here, you have a lag phase. And what happens during the lag phase? It's acclimatization. Acclimatization. So this is when the species is acclimatizing, very slow growth. In fact, it's a complete lag phase. When we look at phase 2, what do we have here? We have accelerated growth. Accelerated growth. Okay, there's your accelerated growth phase. All right, very little limiting factors, or pretty much we can almost say no limiting factors. Remember, it's for 10 marks, so that would be 1, 2, 3, 4. Now phase 3, what happens here? It's a deceleration phase. So deceleration phase. Okay, and with your deceleration phase, you've got your population growth rate slows down. And there's your second mark. Okay, so if we look at between week 10 and 12, we're looking at the 4th phase. We've now gone lag phase, accelerated growth, decelerating phase, so the growth phase is slowing down. And then we look at the 4th phase, and in the 4th phase, we are going to have an equilibrium has been reached. So this is the equilibrium phase. okay? And at an equilibrium phase, we have a stable process. Why? Because the carrying capacity is reached. Okay, that's the carrying capacity. It's been reached, there's an equilibrium. If we look at the fifth phase, which is between week 12 and 14, this is an issue here because here we have the death phase. And that death phase will be because they are now running out of resources. Okay, why? Because we have environmental resistance. So people, you have to know the carrying capacity and the environmental resistance and where that comes in and what it causes. This environmental resistance here is going to then lead to the death phase. In other words, a whole lot of organisms are going to die within a period of 2 weeks. It's rapid, it's quick. Once they've now died, and pretty much most of the population, it's almost half, a little bit more than half, less than half of the population, they can now start climbing again. But that is what you're going to get your marks for. So equilibrium phase, and it's reached the carrying capacity, the death phase because of environmental resistance. And that is a whole 10 marks to explain this graph, which you should know anyway. Then, what kind of competition occurs amongst the individuals of the population, and state a reason for your answer. Now, what competition occurs amongst the individuals of a population? So, what kind of competition would occur? It would be, it's within this species. It's within these little organisms here. We only have one species, which is species A. So automatically, the competition would be inside those the one population. It would therefore be intraspecific competition. It is within one species. Okay, and why? Explain. It's organisms, or you could say individuals within, this is important, within the same species. Oh man. It's the same species. If it was different species, it would be interspecific, and I'm sure you've got that by now. What is the carrying capacity of the habitat? Okay, and provide a reason for your answer. Well, I don't even have to look. I remember it was 120. Why? Because the organisms, or mind you, let me just show you here. You don't even have to look at the graph. You can just look here. It goes week 10, 11, and 12. They're sitting on 120. There's your equilibrium phase. There you've reached the carrying capacity. And eventually, they now start to decrease. Okay, so it's 120, but 120 what? 120 in organisms, or you can say 120 individuals of species A. But please just make sure that you explain what this number is, because very often, not here though, you get a mark for actually giving the term as well. Now provide a reason for your answer. At this point, it's the equilibrium phase is reached, or you can say your natality rate, so birth rate equals death rate, or the natality rate equals mortality. What impact will the introduction of predators have on the population of species A? Now, if you go and you now start introducing a predator, clearly the predator is now going to cause that population to decrease. So you're going to have population decrease, all right, of species A. And the minute that happens, what are we going to have? You're going to give the environment, this is going to lead to a decrease in environmental resistance. Okay, and the minute you have a decrease in environmental resistance, it's going to give species A a chance to increase again. So there's always this cycle. You have your population increase, they reach carrying capacity. When they surpass carrying capacity or they're on carrying capacity for too long, what happens? Environmental resistance will cause the population to decrease. It then gives the environment a chance to stabilize and then increase the carrying capacity again. Okay, people, when we look at symbiosis, symbiosis means to live together. Okay, that's what the word symbiosis means, where within an ecosystem, organisms are either directly or indirectly dependent on one another for survival. We've done this definition before. Please make sure that you know it. It's that organisms are either directly or indirectly dependent on each other to survive, like the grass and the buck and the lions and the cheetahs. Okay, now there are three main types of symbiosis. The first one is parasitism. Second is mutualism, and the third is commensalism. Now, everyone knows what parasitism is. A parasite is a yucky thing that lives off its host, and it doesn't always just apply to organisms. People can be parasites as well. Okay, not in the real sense though. Then you get mutualism. Now, mutual means to both agree. So if you come to a mutual agreement, you both feel the same way, or you feel different, but you've decided to accept each other's views. It's by mutual understanding, mutual agreement. Then commensalism is, well, it's part of being in a community. Someone can do something there, it doesn't affect you, you actually don't care, okay? So with commensalism, one organism is going to benefit and the other one carries on and it doesn't matter. Okay, so that is your different types of symbiosis, and they're the types of symbiosis that you need to know. Okay, people, now we look at parasitism. Now, this is your definition, and you must know it, please. It's the relationship between two organisms. All these relationships, symbiosis is always between two organisms, okay? From different species, where one organism benefits, that's the parasite, and the other is harmed, that's the host, okay? So this is one of those relationships where one is always gets everything they want, and they suck the other one dry, so to speak, and the one is harmed. So benefit and harm is parasitism. The host provides the food and a lovely protected place, habitat, and the parasite in return literally ends up trying its best to kill the host, but it doesn't quite, because the minute it kills its host, it has nowhere to stay. Okay, scientists regard parasitism as a form of predation, because your parasite literally preys on its host, because the parasite feeds and it could cause death, but it's not really what we would term predation. Parasites can be divided into two groups, people, and this is actually very easy. You've got ecto, means outside, okay, and there we've got the word outside, and endo is inside. So you know this from basic biology. Ectoparasites live outside the host's body, and there you've got all various arthropods like your ticks, your fleas, lice, all these yucky things. And then you've got the endoparasites that live inside. So that would be tapeworms, in fact, all kinds of worms that you get, bilharzia, malaria, flatworm, threadworm, yucky worms, all these worms and things that live in organisms. Okay, now, in South Africa, parasitic worms are problematic. Why? Because we've got people, we've got animals. Like, for example, if you have dogs and cats at home, your parents should make sure that little brothers and sisters, especially when the dogs lick them in their faces and lick their food, that they are dewormed regularly, the dogs and the children. Okay, social behavior and overcrowding of the host will result in the spread of the ectoparasites, because remember, they live on the outside. Autopods play a huge role as vectors. Okay, now your vectors are anything that transmits disease. So they act as an intermediate host and to a number of pathogens or things that cause damage. For example, flies and mosquitoes. Flies are disgusting. But anyway, here are a whole bunch. What I did was I drew up this table of an arthropod and the diseases. So you've got your flies as vectors. They can transmit cholera very easily. Remember, a fly goes and it sits wherever it wants to, like on feces or whatever, and then it comes and it sits on your apple, which you're about to bite. So never eat food that's been around where flies have been doing their thing. Okay, then you've got the tsetse flies, also a vector. It causes sleeping sickness. Mosquitoes, malaria, your ticks, they're ectoparasites, tick bite fever. My vets just had tick bite fever. Fleas, also from ectoparasites. You have bubonic plague. So you need to watch out for all these disgusting things. Fleas, well, your adult fleas are a nuisance, really. They cause irritation to pets. They cause allergies and tapeworm infestations, because it's an intermediate host as well. Secondary skin irritations, anemia, because they suck the animal's blood. Flea saliva secretions causes skin irritations. Scratching causes skin. And then also humans. I mean, if you've got animals that have got fleas, you end up with bites, and it's awful. I'm going to show you a picture now. Fleas were the reason why bubonic plague was transmitted in England when they had what was called the Black Plague. Okay, it was because of these fleas. And they also transmit typhoid fever and spread tapeworm eggs. Just going back to bubonic plague, you know that the kiddies' song of Ring a Ring a Rosie's, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. That was coined during the bubonic plague. It was ring a rosies. They got these sores or bruises that looked like bruising. A pocket full of posies. People, because all the death and the dead bodies used to just be taken out of the house and chucked in the alleyway, and these guys would come along and load these dead bodies onto this huge big cart and go and burn them somewhere. Okay, but in the meantime, all the fleas that caused this had already hopped off and they were on to the next people. But a tissue, they got flu symptoms. We all fall down. The people died of bubonic plague. So there's quite a fun nursery rhyme that we all sing and play with as kids, and it's actually got revolting connotations. Anyway, they also transmit typhoid fever and they spread tapeworm eggs. Okay, because they sit on human feces. There's a picture, a photo of a little flea, and you look at that, it looks like something out of Jurassic Park. This is a person's body, and those are all little flea bites. But please don't say, well, that looks like I did when I had measles or whatever. It's very specific bites, and they itch like crazy. All right, control measures. Flea populations, clearly you need to destroy them. So how do you do that? Good sanitation. Make sure everything's clean. Make sure that you poison the fleas. So you put powder on your dogs and cats, and make sure their blankets and things are clean, and dip them. Prevention is always, people, better than cure. Now, there's a hormone that has been developed that is an insect growth regulator. In other words, it stops the eggs from hatching and the larvae from pupating into biting adults. Remember, we've done metamorphosis, so that would come into incomplete metamorphosis. Your plant extracts, you've also got insecticides that are sprayed, okay? You've also got chemicals. There are many shampoos and dips and sprays and powders and collars and tablets that are available. You need to talk to your vet and make sure that your animals are not flea and tick and yucky things like that infested. They sit in your home, they sit around you, you're going to get sick. Tapeworms. Now, if you look at tapeworms, they are the most amazing parasites. Why? Because they definitely prevent rejection. Now, if we look at them, they live inside, they're internal parasites. And what they do is they live off and they absorb what you are digesting. So they've got to make sure that they're adapted to living in the human gut. And how do they do? Well, first of all, they've got a very thick cuticle which protects them from being digested. They also release anti-enzymes. Then their head has hooks and suckers, and they make sure that once they're stuck there, they're stuck there. It's very hard to get rid of them. Its body is flat and segmented, so it increases the surface area, and it doesn't disrupt your food from passing through your digestive system. The tapeworms self-fertilize. They are what we call hermaphrodites. Okay, they're hermaphrodites. They fertilize their own little eggs, and then they lay these eggs, and out they come in the feces, and the flies come and they sit on the feces, and they transfer the eggs to your food, which you then eat. Okay, they deprive the host of nutrients and can cause huge illnesses and serious deficiency diseases. The infected person must take medication to kill the tapeworm, and it's actually quite hard. This is a life cycle of a tapeworm. It has an intermediate host, which is a pig or a cow, and you then become its secondary host. Bilharzia, parasite that causes bilharzia, infects about, now people look at this, 200 million people worldwide, and 250,000 people are killed annually because of bilharzia. Now in South Africa, we've got 3 to 4 million people are infected each year, and most are reported cases in KZN and also the Eastern Cape. Why? Well, your bilharzia is a pathogen, and it's parasitic flatworm, and we call it the liver fluke, or you can call it schistosome. The bilharzia flatworm has 2 hosts. It's got the human and the snail. Here's a life cycle of the bilharzia, liver fluke, blood fluke, all the same thing. This is what we have. It has its intermediate host in those little snails, and the person gets it into their body, or it can be carried on your skin, and it then works its way into your skin. But there you go. You get it, and then it ends up infecting your liver, your pancreas, your kidneys, etc. Now remember, bilharzia and your mosquito larvae are generally found in the same stagnant water. When I was a child, we were told that if you spit in water and your spit bubble doesn't move, you don't swim there, because it's stagnant water. That's where you're going to find the bilharzia. So it was a way of, an old wives' way of making sure we didn't swim in water that was infested with bilharzia. Water must always flow. That's the only water you ever swim in. Okay, apart from swimming pool water. You've got sprays with copper sulfate or chlorine to kill the snails and the mosquito larvae. You destroy the breeding grounds. You introduce a natural enemy, like, for example, ducks. What do? They eat the snails, and they're eco-friendly, which is a huge plus. Boil water. People, you never, ever, ever use water from a stream or a river that is not boiled. That water has not been cleaned. It's got all kinds of nonsense floating around in it. You must boil it, and you must boil it for at least 10 minutes, okay, before drinking or washing any areas where bilharzia is breaking out. So you do not use any water to wash or drink unless you've boiled it. And do not swim or bathe in stagnant water. Remember, if you spit in the water and your spit doesn't move, then you don't swim there. Okay, now we look at mutualism. Mutualism is exactly as the word says. It's a relationship between 2 organisms of different species. You have that same part is in every single one of your definitions for mutualism, commensalism, and for parasitism, where both organisms benefit. Now, this is a nice one. It's mutualism. It's mutualistic. We are all happy and we live together. You've got your nitrogen-fixing bacteria on the root nodules of leguminous plants. So those are plants that make legumes. So anything that looks like a pod. So your peas and your beans are all legumes, so leguminous plants. And what do? They fix the nitrogen for the plant and in return for energy-rich carbohydrates. You've got your sea anemones. I love sea anemones. They're just so amazing. Now, what they do is the sea anemones, the plant, and the plant provides protection for the fish, and the fish, what do? They urinate in between the sea anemone, and that helps the sea, it's ammonia rich, and that helps the sea anemone to survive. So they sort of work together, and they enjoy working together. This is a picture. I've actually seen this. My son and I scuba dive, and we've been down, for example, at Sodwana. You see a lot of sea anemones, and we actually sort of hold on to a portion of rock, and you watch the little clownfish and the anemone and how they're just quite happy to live together. And if you stick your hand there, you're going to get stung. So, and your little clownfish are actually quite aggro because they want to protect, this is their territory, this is the place they stay. So their urine is good for the anemone, and the anemone protects the little clownfish. And if you ever saw Finding Nemo, there's Finding Nemo. Finding Nemo was a clownfish. Okay. Insect pollinated flowers, those pollinating insects and the flower, that is a mutualistic relationship. The insect, the bee, for example, which we've done as social insects, will come along, they'll scratch for nectar, which they use to make honey, and in rubbing around there, they get pollen on their little bodies, and they go to the next flower, and they pollinate the flowers that way. If you ever go, or you've ever been to the Western Cape, where we've got lots of grapes, at the end of each of the rows of grapevines, they have huge, big, beautiful bushes of roses. And you've got all the bees that come to the roses, and in being there, fertilizing and pollinating the roses, they end up pollinating the grapevines too. Plants have developed colorful flowers with huge amounts of nectar and a lovely scent, and that attracts the insects. Now, you know how beautiful roses smell. Then the flowers have adapted to a process by producing anthers that release large quantities of sticky pollen. So when the insect comes along to suck the nectar out, all right, the pollen's going to rub off on them. The flower benefits by cross-pollination, and that ensures genetic variation, because the flower isn't self-pollinating, it's cross-pollinating, genetic variation. Humans benefit because the pollinated flowers produce wonderful fruit, and the little bees are happy because they get honey. Okay, people, you've also got cellulose digesting microbes like bacteria, and they live in the guts of ruminants. Now, your ruminants would be cows, for example, sheep, etc. Okay, the cows provide a protected area to live in, and you've got an anaerobic environment for the little bacteria. And what do the bacteria do? They have an enzyme that they produce to help break down the cellulose into simple compounds. And anyway, so as the digestion process takes place, your cow is going to get glucose, and we benefit because we can obtain the food and the stored energy in the muscle of the cow. So we're happy there. If we look at commensalism, so now let's just recap. Parasitism, one of the organisms benefits and the other one is harmed. Mutualism, they both benefit. And commensalism is the relationship, now here's the same in every one of the definitions, is the relationship between two organisms of different species where one organism benefits and the other is neither harmed nor benefits. In other words, it doesn't matter, it doesn't care that there's any benefit being derived. So here we'll have in tropical and subtropical forests, your orchids. They need the trees, the branches of the trees, to grow on so they can get air and they can get water and moisture and light. Whereas the tree doesn't care if there's this orchid growing on it. The same with trees and a bird's nest. The tree doesn't benefit. The tree is neither harmed nor benefits. it doesn't care whether the bird's nest is in the tree, but the bird definitely benefits. Okay, just also going back to the orchids, they have no root system, so they need the tree to lift them up so they can get sunlight. They also adapted to catch water and the drippings from the leaves, but the tree really doesn't benefit in any way. Okay, birds make their nests, I've already said that. The chicks are shaded and they're protected from predators, but the tree doesn't care. The remora fish. Now, the remora fish attach themselves to the sides of a shark. And as the shark moves around and it eats, little bits of food fly out of the shark's mouth. So the remora fish detach themselves and they catch that food. So they benefit, and the shark actually doesn't care. All right, so the shark just swims happily on. Here is a picture of a shark, and there your remora fish. They attach to the shark and they just swim along. And as the shark lets food come out of the sides of its mouth, so they benefit. Now, if we look at the influence of the human influence on a community structure, we live on every corner of this planet. And as the human population increases, we have an increase on our demand for. Think about it. I mean, this is, okay, it's written here, but you must make sure that you can actually relate this in an exam or a test. And this is really not something you need to learn. Think about the impact that we have. Wherever we live, what do we need? We need factories. Okay, we need industries, we need houses, we need food, we need jobs, we need bridges, we need roads. All the things that we as human beings need, we take from the environment. And we will build our structures there at the cost of the natural environment around us. Technology, all you have to do is look at technology and how many people there are on this planet. So the population explosion. And what have we done? We're just destroying the natural environment. Now, this is where we must now start looking at sustainable development. Now, we've spoken about the word sustainable before, in sessions before. Sustainable means that we are able to keep on doing that for the next 50 million years. It's sustainable. It is going to work. We are looking at all aspects to be able to work together. So it means the present and future human needs are met without damaging the environment. And it is part, people look at this, of our Bill of Rights. Okay, and it's in our South African Constitution that we have a right to living in a world that is undamaged. This process is an interrelationship. Now remember, inter-specific competition means between. This is an interrelationship involving the society, us, the environment, everything around us, and also we need to make money, so economy. And if we have those three components in a balance, then we have sustainable development. So there must be a balance. Then we can make it happen for a long time. So how do we do this? We have legislation, we have proper governance, and that provides a guideline, and it says, listen guys, you can't just go and fish and pull out all the paddlemon out of the ocean and just eat them all until there's nothing left. They say you can't just go and catch crayfish and just haul out all the crayfish and clean all the crayfish off the Cape Coast. You can't do that. There's legislation that says you can only catch crayfish if they're a certain size. If they're not, you need to throw them back. Okay? So they must be a certain size. You can only catch a certain number of them at a time. So we have got legislation and governance that protects our natural resources. But we still then get the money in and we can develop as human beings. Something else that I've just thought of is you've got that whole St. Lucia environmental process that's going on. And you got the St. Lucia wetlands. And they said, no, hold on. These are wetlands. This is a natural treasure for South Africa. You're not just going to come and mine here and just mess this whole place up. So there's a huge conflict going on there between economic viability and sustaining the environment. So there is something for us to look at that's beautiful and worthwhile. Establish population sizes of various organisms within the community so that they can understand what is becoming extinct and what is overpopulated. Okay, study the impact of specific species and how those species are actually surviving within the community. And this is where we have a problem with what we call alien and natural organisms. Okay, if they are alien, they only cause issues. All right. Whereas if something occurs naturally within the environment, it will have its natural predators. It will have a natural population process that occurs to maintain a stable environment. Okay, as soon as something is alien, then we have a problem. If it's natural, we also say it is indigenous. So it's indigenous to that area. It's found naturally. We limit the environmental resistance and we maintain the carrying capacity. So we make sure that everything stays within reasonable numbers. Now we have human intervention. And how does this happen? If we have a game farm where we have nothing that can keep the elephant population in track, or the wildebeest population, or the impala population on track and limit the size so that we have natural resistance, we then end up with humans that have to now come and intervene. And that's when we have culling. So they either cull the animals, they kill them, or they relocate them to another farm or another place, or they introduce natural predators into the habitat. And we have to conduct impact studies. And what those impact studies do is they say, okay, by doing this thing, you are affecting the environment in A, B, C, D, E, F, G. If we do this, we're going to influence it that way. And if we do that, we influence it in this way. What is it that we want as human beings? So we conduct impact studies, and what they do is they tell us, for example, deforestation and pollution and the effects that has on plants and animals, and how are we going to stop it? So they start putting strategies together. Okay, people, we now look at ecotourism, hunting and culling. Really, I think this is something that you've done since grade 8. You've got your game reserves and your game farms, and the problem is there we have a lack of natural predators. A lot of your game farms have got your buck type game, okay, and they'll have kudus and impalas and duikers and all the rooibok and steenboks, etc. But they don't always have the big five, and part of the big five would be your lions and leopards and cheetahs and okay, look, well, rhinos really don't matter here or there, or elephants, but it's your animals that hunt and are predators. At certain times of the year, these animals must be culled. Why? If they are not culled, they will destroy the environment. They will reach and overreach their carrying capacity, and by doing that, environmental resistance will kick in. And I'm sure that by now you understand that and you know that. Okay, so how do we keep it constant? We have to cull the animals. And if the animals are not culled, we're going to destroy the environment. This lowers the carrying capacity, and like, for example, we have the National Parks Board and the Department of Natural Conservation. And let me tell you, they do a lot of good work. And they ensure that hunting is allowed during only specific seasons. It doesn't help going hunting and you shoot this buck and you shoot a pregnant female, okay? Because what happens? You're killing 2 animals there. So they will only allow them to hunt once reproduction has taken place and the babies have been born. And then also only once those babies are of a certain age where they don't need their mother. Because if they're still little and you shoot the mother, well, you've killed the baby as well. Okay? Game hunters from all over the world come to South Africa. They bring lots of money, which is good, to the areas, and then they come and they shoot our game. And the money is used for game hunt. It contributes to our economy in our country. But it must be regulated. And if we regulate it, we keep those populations within carrying capacity. Here is a photo of the Kruger National Park, and what we have here are our elephants, and they are just too gorgeous for words. I absolutely love elephants. I think they're highly intelligent and they're just beautiful. But if there are too many of them, they can wreak havoc. They actually destroy huge tracts of land. The population explosion, this is us. Urbanization means living in cities and towns. Industry, the people in factories don't always do what they should, and they pump all kinds of rubbish into the streams and etc. Agriculture, we got to clear these huge tracts of land, okay, and to plant mealies and wheat and corn and whatever it is that we plant. And then mining, and they've all impacted on our natural communities. Agriculture, what do we have there? We have things called monocultures. And monocultures are huge tracts of land where only one type of food is planted in a season. And it's those monocultures just destroy thousands of species of animals and plants. Cities destroy natural habitat. We have animals like wild dogs, monkeys, baboons, coyotes, and they've got nowhere to live, because what you've done is you've said, well, we're living here now, so you need to go away. And the animals are turning around and saying, but you haven't left us enough land, or they don't say it, it's the feeling. We haven't left them enough land to actually survive. We've taken away their food, their shelter, their space, their water, because we've decided, well, this is a very nice place to build this suburb. So what about the monkeys and the whatevers? We just poison them and kill them. It doesn't matter. And that's how human beings do things. So they come to a residential area. Why? To find food, and they're dangerous. They're wild animals. They're not supposed to be in a residential area. We also have pollution and deforestation, huge problem, where it kills incredible, vast tracts of organisms are dead. We take away all the natural resources. We take away the animals and the natural enemies, and we just cause death to a whole bunch of animals. This is a picture that I took off Global Animal, and here you've got a monkey in the middle of Cape Town, busy in a suburban area, busy digging the dustbin for food. Now, digging for food out of a dustbin is much easier than going and trying to find food in the little koppie or the mountain that this animal actually lives. So what do? They migrate to the suburban area. But remember, that suburb is built on their territory, it's on their land. And then these animals start wreaking havoc. Okay, the impact of human influence on the community structures can be reduced by educating people, using the correct farm methods, okay, and correct pest control. Because remember, if one pest gets into that monoculture, it basically infects that entire field of food quick. Okay, mealies, wheat, whatever it is. So pest control. So what do people do? They spray. And when they spray, we end up with insecticides and pesticides in the water table. And that causes issues for the ecology within the waters of rivers and streams and dams and the sea. So we as human beings need to actually put a huge big brake on the things that we're doing. Pollution prevention and care, advantages of recycling. We need to look at birth control. China decided that they were going to be a one-child state. So if people decided they wanted more than one child, they had to pay such incredible taxes that they couldn't afford a second child, the normal people. So they actually had a negative growth rate for many years, and it's worked. You no longer have such major overpopulation. Endangered species and the necessity to conserve our indigenous fauna and flora, and we need to design and use alternative energy sources. Okay, all of these things you have done through your school career in grade 8, 9, 10, and 11. You've gone through the advantages of recycling to prevent pollution, to find other sources of energy so that we don't use all our fossil fuels too quickly. You've done all of this. Just make sure that you understand it forms part of this process as well. Now we look at community, which is a community change over time, and we're looking at something called ecological succession. This is how organisms become a species and they succeed and they survive in an area. Okay, so ecological succession is the orderly change in structure of a community, and that is your definition. Okay, all communities change in response to internal and external factors. All communities. We certainly don't live the way people did 150 years ago, because we've had cars, we've had aeroplanes, we've got the cell phone. Okay, 150 years ago, they didn't have a telephone. They used to write messages and send people via horseback. So a lot of things have changed. Just think of us as human beings. So if those changes are internal, we call them autogenic. Auto comes from the word automatic. It happens without thinking. It happens internally. External are allogenic factors. So if the abiotic factors remain relatively constant, the biotic community, which is the living, remember that's the non-living factors, temperature, climate, light, water, etc. Biotic, all your living organisms will develop over time from a bare rock or an open water to a climax community. Now, climax community is one that's got everything. A climax community is complex, it's diverse, it's productive, and it is stable. And that is your definition there for a climax community. It's complex, it's involved, diverse, productive, and stable. Now, when there's a fire, deforestation, a flood, volcanic eruption, what do? We destroy that climax community, okay? And there's a whole bunch of changes that take place after that. So now we look at something called succession. Organisms modify their environment through a process of succession. Succession means to succeed. So, for example, if a king dies, he is succeeded by his son, all right? Succession. So individual successions are called series. And no, it's not spelt with a C, and it's not the place where fresh fruit juice comes from. It's series with an S-E-R-E-S. And the developmental phases are called seral stages. You must know this. This is important. And I would ask it to you in multi-choices or in long questions. Now, the process begins with autotrophs. Those are your plants, and with your detrital feeders and your decomposers. These are your worms, woodworms and wood lice and things like that. Okay? A new plant species is added. Herbivores, secondary consumers follow to complete the food web, okay, forming a complex biotic community. The tropical rainforests, what we have there is that they are well established. So they're rich, they're diverse, they're complex biotic communities. But if we look at succession principles, they can be applied when addressing the impact of humans. So we come along, we have mine dumps, we have motorways, we have landfills, and what are we doing? We're saying, well, we want to become a stable environment, and in doing so, we end up messing up the environment around us for plants. You must know the difference between autogenic succession and allotropic succession. So this is when a stimulus for change is internal, and it's caused by organisms in the biotic communities. So let's have a look. It's an internal change, autogenic succession. Here, for example, one plant will come along and it turns the pH, or the fertility of the soil is affected. Okay, that changes any new animal or plant species that are going to come and eat the plants. So your different plants will lead to different animals inhabiting the area. So you've got one small thing, a change in the pH or the fertility of the soil. You're going to have different organisms growing, and therefore different animals will follow. When trees mature in a forest, they produce more shade, okay? which means that you're going to, when they were smaller, they had less leaves. As they grow bigger, they're going to block out the sun, and your shrubs growing below are going to now have less light. Okay, they're going to have more shade, less sunlight. So what happens? If they aren't shade tolerant, they're going to die, and another species will take over that can tolerate it, like, for example, ferns. Allogenic succession, this is when the stimulus for change is external to the biotic communities, and the following are examples. We have changes in the composition of the soil. Why? Because of erosion, silt deposits, leaching, all those pesticides and insecticides going into the water table, mine dumps, chemical deposits. So you change the composition of the soil. You're not just changing the fertility or the pH because a plant has caused that. You're changing the whole bang shoot, and it's because we are doing this, or because there's a natural catastrophe. Climate changes in temperature and rainfall over long periods of time. For example, during the Ice Age, and what we have now, global warming. We've got catastrophes like volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and floods and hurricanes and fires. All of those catastrophes are going to affect the succession. And because they are from outside, they are going to be allogenic successions. Autogenic successions are because of the plants themselves. Okay, it occurs naturally. Now, this sequence of succession process, you're always going to have a primary succession, and in that primary succession, you're going to start with a new uncolonized habitat. Okay, and there is a lack of soil, or when land or lakes have emerged after a glacier or something. That will be followed by your pioneer species. And the pioneer species is going to develop like your mosses and your algae and your lichens and fungi. And what happens is they form part of the R strategy. Okay, lots of organisms that produce lots of offspring, but there's a very low survival rate. That's followed by your opportunistic species, which follow. And they are going to have good seed dispersal. They're going to make sure that they can live and grow and survive. They've got tolerance, and they end up replacing the pioneer species. So that would be an example, because it's within this area, of autogenic succession. Then climax populations come along. They are your K strategy. So our strategy is always going to be where you're going to have lots of offspring, but very low survival. And later on, your more complex are going to be K strategy. They have fewer offspring, but they have a high survival rate. Okay? They normally have parental care. Climax populations form an environment where the carrying capacity has been reached and is stable. The succession process results in a complex biotic community within the ecosystem. And if we look here, this is primary succession. You must know the difference between autogenic, okay, and allogenic succession, and you must know the difference in primary succession and secondary succession. The easiest way to remember the difference between primary and secondary is to look at this schematic that's here. You're going to have a rock surface or hostile environment. Okay, it's completely brand new. There is nothing that's growing here, like after a volcano. The pioneer species, or the R strategy, are autotrophic. So you've got your lichen, they'll colonize that rock surface. They secrete chemicals that break down the rock surface. And by the way, breaking the rock into sand is called pedogenesis. Okay, that's rock to sand or soil. All right, then the lichen dies. So when the lichen dies, what does it do? It gets decomposed, which means it starts to give this soil here some fertility. The soil and the nutrients are available for new species, and then we get our opportunistic species developing. And then we have our climax populations, the K strategy animals and plants, and we end up with a stable, complex community. So The biggest difference is between primary and secondary is primary, you're going to have a rock surface that's absolutely hostile. There is no life there. There's nothing to start with. It's a brand new place. Okay. We then go to secondary succession. Okay, this is just to show you over time how a forest will succeed. So here we'll start off with soil. This would be an example of secondary succession and not primary succession. So let's move on with secondary succession. Here it develops after an established biotic community has been destroyed. So it all coexisted successfully, and then it was destroyed by fire and natural catastrophe, deforestation, harvesting of a crop, a flood, a glacier, whatever. That area is destroyed, but you have soil, you have good solid soil to start off with. So we look here and we say, right, the soil is always already present. And it has dead organic matter, and it may have some seeds. It will have nutrients from the previous communities. If there's a veld fire, for example, you start off again. The process is always your pioneer species, your opportunistic species, and then your climax species. Pioneer, opportunistic, climax. So your pioneer species come along, and then they followed quickly by the opportunistic species, and that's followed quickly enough by the climax species, and everybody's happy, and it provides food and shelter, water, space for animals. Now, this would be like, for example, when a field is being cleared for a crop, and it's left uncultivated. So they sort of come in, planted mealies. Mealies are ripe, we've picked them, they've been harvested, and now we clean the field, and the field's sitting there. And within a couple of weeks, you're going to find little plants and things that are growing there. So when it's left uncultivated, you're going to get your small shrubs. They're opportunistic. You're going to get trees. Climax species are going to grow. You're going to get your grasses and marram grass and lime grass and little, all grow on your sand dunes and things. Okay? Algae will grow in stagnant water or very slow-flowing water. And that's going to give shelter to little snails and tadpoles and small fish. And it's those snails with a very slow and stagnant water that are going to end up with bilharzia, just as a reminder. The succession process results in a complex biotic environment. So the difference between primary succession and secondary succession is this first step here. With primary succession, there is nothing. It's this volcanic rock that's sitting there, or bare rock, all right? Secondary succession, you are always going to start with an established biotic community that is then destroyed, okay? So in that destruction, you are going to find soil. You're going to find organic matter. You're going to find little seeds. You're going to find nutrients because the soil is still present. It's already present. Your pioneer species, which is your case strategy, lots of offspring, very few make it to survive. You get your opportunistic species, then you get your climax populations, which are case strategy. What's the difference between R and K? Your case strategy, what do they have? They have fewer offspring, but a higher survival rate. And at the end, we end up with a stable, complex community. Here, for example, is a forest that had a whole veld fire that went through it, quite a lot of chopping down and falling over of trees, etc. And within a couple of weeks, here is your opportunistic. So it's already gone from your primary to your opportunistic little organisms surviving here. Here again, we have our little bushes and our shrubs, the odd tree, and mainly the types of grass that grow. All right, we're doing our last question. Okay, the diagram below illustrates succession in a plant community, and study the diagram and answer the questions that follow. Now, what are we going to do here? We're going to have a look at what processes this represents. So A, what are we going to have at A? All you have to do is look at this and say, right, here, this is going to be secondary succession. Why? Because with secondary succession, we are going to have soil. So our soil is already there, even though it's bare soil. We then get our little organisms that start out. they get a bit bigger and more complex. We move on to shrubs, we move on to larger trees, and we move up to huge trees. So that's what we can see here. Okay, so let's have a look at our questions. What is meant by the term succession? Now, people, you need to know it is the orderly, and that's important. It is the orderly and gradual change. Okay, orderly and gradual change where one plant or animal community, okay, is replaced by another in a given area over a specific period. Okay, now look at what I've written here. Succession, it's the orderly and gradual change where a plant or animal community is replaced by another in a given area over a specific period. So your marks are going to be orderly and gradual, where a plant or animal community is replaced in a given area over a specific period. And that's your 4 marks. Okay. Which marked part, R, S, or T, represents succession, climax, or colonization? So it's R, S, or T. So let's have a look at our diagram. R, S, or T. So we've got to decide which one is going to be climax. I've forgotten the order now. So R is climax. Okay, so let's go and write this in. So it's R, S, or T. R is S. Climax would be T. It was at the end. And colonization would be R. So we start off with R as colonization. Then we move on to the different successions. And then we move on to our climax community. Okay. What are the various stages of succession called? Okay. Now remember, the pieces of it were series. So your succession stages will be seral. Seral what? Seral stages. Okay, never just give the answer. Always give the answer and say why you are, what it is. Okay, which part marked A, B, C, or D represents small bushes? A, B, C, or D. Now, I mean, really, people, use your eyes. Clearly, those are our small little bushes. All right, so it would be B. Distinguish between autogenic and allogenic succession. Okay, so if we look at autogenic, remember I said to you, auto always means on its own. So this is when the stimulus is internal, okay? That should be 1 mark. And caused by organisms in the biotic communities. Or you can say caused by biotic organisms. Okay, so biotic organisms in a biotic community or caused by biotic organisms, that gives you your 2nd mark there. Allogenic. Okay, so remember this is internal. Allogenic is going to be when the stimulus is external So there's your mark there, 2 biotic communities. And that's where you get your 3 marks. So autogenic is internal and it's caused by organisms in the biotic community. Allogenic is when the stimulus is external to the biotic. So it's not caused by them, it is external to them. Okay? Question 6, tabulate the differences between primary and secondary succession. Now remember, if it's 7 marks, 1 of them is for actually drawing a table. Because if they say tabulate, you must tabulate. So it's for drawing these lines. I mean, for heaven's sake, people. It's easy mark to get. Okay? So primary and secondary succession. So if we're going to put primary succession here and secondary succession. Okay? So okay, this one, the differences. So remember, as we go through, you're going to have the same point being compared. So here, it develops in a new, uncolonized area or habitat. Okay? And your secondary succession is always going to be an established habitat that has been destroyed. Okay, it's been destroyed. For whatever reason, it's destroyed, but it was established. So it's after an established habitat has been destroyed. Okay, so that would be point 1. Point 2, this would develop after land and lake emerge, after a glacier retreat or a volcanic eruption has taken place. Okay, so that it's all destroyed. There is nothing. It's totally uncolonized. And with your secondary, here you've got a natural catastrophe. Catastrophe. Okay, and a natural catastrophe would be something like a hurricane, floods, deforestation, harvesting of a crop, in other words, that area, the soil is there, but everything has been flattened out. Okay? Now we have to give 3 factors. So a third one, I would say here there is a lack of soil. So now remember the word we did just now, pedogenesis must first take place to produce soil. Okay, remember your pioneer species are going to need, at least your opportunistic species are going to need the soil. And then on this side here, we already have fertile soil. So fertile soil is already present. Because remember, if a field of mealies has been harvested and that field is now cleaned and all the rubbish is taken out of it and they plow it over and the dead organic matter is put back into the soil, you've got fertile soil, you've got some seeds sitting there, you've got nutrients in there, you've got dead decaying matter in there. It is fertile. It just has no plants. All right, so that would be the difference or the comparison between primary and secondary. So that would be a mark, that and that and that. And then we move down to 3, plus 1 for drawing a table, and that will give you your 7 marks. Okay, last question, or second last one, I think. It says, explain the difference between R strategy and K strategy. Now, it's actually very easy. R strategy is I always think of our strategy representing rats, and I always think of rats as little tiny creatures that run around and scavenge. Okay, so there are lots of them, and they make, but that's just in my head, that's how I remember it. Okay, so your R strategy organisms are your opportunistic organisms and your primary succession organisms, where you're going to have like lots of offspring, but very few survive and make it to adulthood. Okay, whereas, and like with insects, whereas with your K strategy, they are larger, they are bigger, they are more complex. All right, so we have less offspring, but we have a higher survival rate. And very often, if they're animals, you're going to have parental care taking place, and not just like insects where they lay the eggs and it's, well, if the eggs hatch, they hatch. If they don't, they don't. It's not an issue. All right. And then if we look at question 8, 8a, what is the plant community in the first stage of succession called? Now, if it's in its first stage of succession, remember there are 3. You get your pioneer plants, okay, or your pioneer species. Okay, so they pioneer plants or species. Which part marked A, B, C, or D represents a community mentioned in A? So we're looking at the pioneer species. We're going to have to go all the way back to our diagram. Which here would be our pioneer species? It would be A. They're your pioneers. Okay. Name 3 different types of animals that may be found in the part mentioned in 6b. In other words, what are we going to find in the pioneer plant and animal species? Well, people think about it. What do you find in areas where there are only little tiny bits of shrubs and tiny little new plants, etc.? You're going to find ants. You're going to find termites. You're going to find little grasshoppers. You're going to find a couple of lizards as well, I think. They're always where it's just like bare. You're going to find mice and rats. So any of those are going to be your starting off organisms. Have lots of babies, your ants, your termites. There won't be bees. Why? Because they're on flowers. And bees want flowers because they make honey. So it would be your ants and termites. I can't think of anything else. Grasshoppers, lizards, mice, rats, etc., etc. Just use your common sense. Think about areas where nothing grows, and just a couple of lichen and maybe algae, and what would you see there? If it was water, so clearly not this example, but if it was sort of water, your pioneer species would be your tadpoles and mosquito larvae, because your tadpoles would feed on the mosquito larvae. So just use your common sense and think about what it is that you're being asked. And yeah, that brings us to an end on environment. And we move on to the whole evolution process now, and how evolution and diversity and why organisms are different. Okay, so there we go, people. I hope you've enjoyed this. Use your common sense. Remember that parasitism, one party benefits, which is the parasite, and the host is harmed. Mutualism, both organisms are going to benefit. Okay? And commensalism, one benefits and the other one actually doesn't care. It makes no difference. Another example of mutualism, at least commensalism, by the way, is cows, when they are grazing and little birds called egrets. And the egrets walk around next to the cow's feet. And as the cow walks through this long grass, the insects all fly off, and the little egret goes chips, 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 and catches them. So it uses the cow to release all the organisms. But that would be commensalism. But then we'd have mutualism, where a cow has an oxpecker, and the oxpecker eats ticks. So it sits on the cow and it zaps the tick off. The oxpecker is getting a nice full tummy, and the tick is being, the cow is being de-ticked. Please make sure, and I'm saying it again, you know the difference between allogenic and autogenic succession. Make sure you know the different phases in succession: pioneer, opportunistic, climax. And that's basically what you need to learn in this section. K strategy and R strategy. R strategy, lots of babies, or lots of offspring, very little survival. K strategy, whoa, they kick. They are perfect. And what we have there is that they look after their babies, less babies, more chances of survival. And there you go, people. Have an awesome time studying and actually enjoy your life sciences. It's a living, wonderful subject. And remember, please recycle, become green, look after the environment. It's your kids one day that are going to suffer and have to live without anything. So look after this world of ours. It's precious. Be good, have a wonderful time, and goodbye for now.